This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are a member of the Parthenon podcast network. A huge thanks goes out to Garry Stevens yet again of the History in the Bible podcast. Links to learn more about Garry and his podcast can be found at historyinthebible.com or in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can contact me there or just send an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. Welcome back to another collaboration between the History of the Papacy podcast, the History in the Bible podcast, and I'll put on my Beyond the Big Screen podcast hat too. So I'm wearing two hats. If you were watching on YouTube, which we're not doing YouTube anymore, but if we were on YouTube, I'd be wearing two hats, I suppose. You can imagine that. But today we're tackling the big one, the movie of all movies, history of Christianity related, history of Bible, Judaism, you name it. And that is 2004's The Passion of the Christ, written and directed by Mel Gibson. So Garry, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. And I have difficulty believing that movie came out 17 years ago.
Yeah, it's pretty unbelievable.
Yeah, it feels like it just came out last month or something.
And I believe that they're coming out with the sequel to it in not too long from when we're recording this. Really? Yeah.
That'll be interesting. Jesus Part 2.
And maybe it's titled The Passion Resurrection. So I think that probably gives a little
clue.
So maybe we could talk about that at some time, what we might predict would be in that film. It would definitely be a lot less gory than this one.
That's true.
Although Mel Gibson's involved, so you never know what might happen. The Passion of the Christ from 2004 is Mel Gibson's approach to the Passion, and in his historical filmmaking phase where he had Braveheart to the Patriot, which were very much stretching calling them historical, really stretching that to its breaking point. And then the movie Apocalypto and The Passion, where Mel used native languages and had a very different storytelling style. I think a good thing for us to maybe talk about up front is our own views about this movie. And just to put it out there, on the Rotten Tomatoes, the movie gets a 49% grade from the critics and then an 80% from the audience. So it's always interesting to see a big disparity between the critics and the audiences in Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I thought, Garry, maybe you could go first because you have some strong opinions about your countryman Mel Gibson and some connections with him.
Now, Mel and I were born 3 days apart, so we are almost exact contemporaries. Mel was born in America and came to Australia for his youth, and he went to drama school in Sydney. And I saw him in a production of The Death of a Salesman, where he seemed perfectly competent. So I have seen the man close up for a while. I haven't shaken his great hand, but still. Now, I just don't like the man. Don't really ask me why. I just don't like him. I don't like James Spader either, although I've only ever seen 3 minutes of him on the screen. I tend to find Mel is belligerent. And you must admit, he's belligerent in his private life, isn't he? And then we get into the discussion of how much do you separate the man from the work? If we go way back to, say, the painter Caravaggio, love Caravaggio's paintings, but the guy was a murderer, out murderer. Woody Allen would be the classic modern case. I still like Woody Allen, although he seems to be quite a creep. But Mel, well, see, I'm happy to find fault with Mel for even his hair dye colour. And he does, but on the other hand, he does seem to make well-crafted, high-production value films. There's no doubt about that. And this film is the same. It's well-produced, well-acted, but it seems rather extreme. Now, would you agree with the extreme bit?
Oh, yeah. I mean, extreme is probably the lightest word you can use. I mean, and I don't remember it affecting me so much because I did watch it in the theater. And I think maybe not really. At that point, I wasn't quite as familiar. I was familiar with this Passion narrative in its broadest strokes. But I don't know, maybe because I didn't know it as quite a detail as I do now after doing a podcast on all these things and reading the documents and all that. I don't know. I connected to it quite differently this last time, and it was very hard to watch.
You said something which never occurred to me about the difference between, say, the Catholic and the Protestant approaches to the Passion.
Yeah, so Mel comes to this from a very distinct perspective of a traditionalist Catholic, capital T, capital C, and they have a very brutal definition of the Passion and perspective on the Passion, and they look at it through they really focus in on the pain and all of those, the more horrific aspects of the Passion than maybe other Catholics do, or Orthodox, or even certain Protestants do. It's really, they put a lot into the physicality of the Passion than others do.
I mean, if you look at a Catholic cross, it often has Jesus on the cross, doesn't it? But you'll rarely find that in a Protestant church. I mean, it's just a plain cross in a Protestant church.
And you'll see in a Catholic where Jesus is bleeding with the crown of thorns on, and there's blood, or there's blood coming from the various wounds, where you won't generally see that in Orthodox iconography. I believe too in Catholic, in Catholic iconography, and you'll see this in the film where they almost break Jesus's feet to nail them through. That won't be depicted in, say, I don't believe even in early iconography, but in Eastern iconography, you won't see that as well. Right. And so I think that it's interesting that why you don't like Mel. And I think there's actors like Nicolas Cage. I can't watch anything Nicolas Cage is in because there's just something about him. And then probably mine that's on the same level as yours with, now probably everybody's going to tune out now, is Tom Hanks.
Oh, okay. You can't stand him.
No, and I really can't put my finger on why precisely, and I've enjoyed some of his movies, and it's nothing really in particular with his personal life or his acting. I just, for him, and this is maybe getting too much of a tangent, he's Tom Hanks in every role.
Yes. Yeah, you wouldn't call him a character actor, would you?
No. Yeah, he is himself.
Yeah. Well, just as a final, let me add one final actor I cannot stand, and that's Tom Cruise. Like Hanks, Cruise is always exactly the same person. And he's also one of these people who always has to be portrayed looking good. I once read an interesting thing about Bruce Willis. You know the film 12 Monkeys?
Yeah.
Well, in that film, he spends most of it drooling and gibbering and looking really bad. So Willis is an actor who's quite happy to be pictured looking just terrible. But Cruise, in his arrogance, always has to look like the pretty boy. So anyway, enough of that. We could rave about actors we can't stand for years.
Yeah, if there's somebody who you want to rant about out there, you can send us an email and we can definitely sympathize with you. I think that one of the things that I appreciated about the movie is that it fairly much stuck to the gospel account, and then it sprinkled in a sprinkling of some apocryphal works, and then a sprinkling of Mel Gibson's artistic license. And I think that those little sprinklings were nice enough that it didn't overwhelm, that it fairly much did stick with the gospel account.
Yes, indeed. In fact, it's remarkably faithful to them, even in the dialogue, isn't it? I mean, he has he hasn't created any new dialogue that I can find, and he's stuck pretty closely to whatever English language translation he was using, which then apparently was translated by some scholar into Aramaic and Latin. So it's if you have a combined versions of the Gospels, if you have okay, I'll get to Tatian in a minute. No, let's clear that up. Mel uses a crashed together version of the Gospels. Each of the Gospels has slightly different accounts of the Passion. They differ. Mel basically says, well, we'll ignore the differences and just whack everything in together. And he uses that. Now, that tradition of putting all 4 Gospels together into one big fat document is actually quite ancient, and it goes back to a guy called Tatian, at least I hope it's pronounced Tatian. And he wrote a book called the Diatessaron, which is literally putting all the Gospels into one place. That idea dropped out, I think, by about the year 400, leaving us with our 4 separate Gospels today. But even today, most people won't just say read Luke and say this is the story. They'll also remember bits from Matthew and John and think of them all as the one thing. So he's done that, and he's done it in quite a reasonable way.
And I believe that there's really that harmonization, kind of the way we commonly tell the Christmas story, is a harmonization too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Luke and Matthew, each of them has huge elements which the other does not. So one gospel has the shepherds, the other doesn't. One has the wise men, the other doesn't. So that's, it's exactly the way we think of the Christmas story. We don't think of them as the 2 separate accounts.
I believe that Tatian, he was in about the 200s-ish, if I probably should have looked that up, but 200-ish is what comes to my mind. It was really a function of the time and the place where having that amount of writing material to write 4 separate codices and then carrying 4 separate codices, it made a lot more sense to just have one common narrative that you could go and, basically sell.
Yes.
When you're going to a new place. Well, you know what? This guy, Luke, he said this, but then John said this, and then Matthew said this, and it's all a little bit different. If you had something that was a coherent narrative, it was a lot easier to not only physically carry in your saddlebag, but it was also, figuratively an easier thing to do. And then the last couple of points that to just set the stage a little bit is that I appreciated, and I think that every movie should really, historical movie, it would be so much better served to have the movie in the native language, because it's a totally different movie than if it had been everybody used a posh English accent, which is a stand-in for a historical sounding historical. I think that it put you into the world that Mel Gibson's trying to tell us and get us into.
Yeah, that was quite good. And we're assuming that the Aramaic is actually real Aramaic. Actually, no, I was just wondering that. I've met people who say they refuse to watch any movie that's subtitled. They just don't do it. And I've read that different countries have different traditions. So from what I gather, in most of Europe, a foreign language film will be subtitled, fine. But apparently in Italy, the tradition is you dub it into Italian. So I'm wondering if the Italians dubbed The Passion of the Christ into Italian.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah. I personally can't stand dubbed.
No, I hate it. Because you don't get the nuance from the voice or anything, do you? And usually the dubbing it's either bland or flat or inappropriate. Yeah, I hate dubbing.
And there really is, you get something, even if you don't understand the language, from their intonation, you get something out of it that just does not come across in dubbing.
Yeah, exactly.
And as far as the Aramaic goes, I didn't see anything that was a major, and that anything that people had a major problem with the Aramaic. I mean, I think it's a lot like the Latin. You have to just kind of choose which Latin you're going to go with, because there was, so much. The Latin of the 400s was different than Caesar's Latin, which was different from first century Latin. And so I'm sure there's a very similar case with Aramaic. Even with Latin today, I believe that there's kind of a controversy in the Catholic Church the way Latin is pronounced by English speakers as opposed to Europeans.
Oh.
That the Europeans, it almost sounds like Italian, and it has sort of an Italian accent to it, where in the American and English, they'll go a lot more with making it sound like something like a textbook.
Yes, in fact, I have personal experience of this. When I was looking up the pronunciation of some Latin words for my show, I stumbled across a couple of websites which have Latin pronunciation. And there was one website which was markedly different. For example, the letters SC, it said were pronounced sh. Other websites were saying, no, they're pronounced sk. I was thinking, yeah, this one particular website, all the vowels are sort of different and the consonants are different. And it turned out the website, the aberrant website, was using Church Latin, which apparently moves Latin much more towards Italian. And that confused me endlessly for weeks as I was trying to compare it to the other websites and going, what the hell's going on here? So I'd accidentally stumbled across a Church Latin website. And as far as I know, that Latin it's just used in the church, and it's just traditional that way.
So pretty much anybody who's using Latin not that many scholars will write in their text in Latin, but if they're pronouncing something in Latin, they're going to use that other standard.
Yeah, they'll use,
which is earlier.
I think that actually happened in English studies in the early 1900s until about, I don't know, maybe the First World War. If you're taught Latin, you pronounced it the church way. And then there was a big movement to pronounce it roughly like 1st century BC Latin, the Romans did. And that's the way it is to this day. So,
because it would be interesting I don't know enough Latin to say one way or the other how it's some of the things that people were saying sounded odd, or it didn't sound like the way I would have probably have pronounced it. And so in Latin, my guess is that Mel, being a traditionalist Catholic, probably goes to Latin Mass.
And uses the church Latin. Yeah. Oh, that's a point.
Like they're counting when they were doling out the lashes. With my basic knowledge of Latin, it sounded almost like they were counting in Italian.
Actually, that's
like kind of funny sounding Italian.
That struck me too. I distinctly remember that. It's sort of going, una, due. Yeah, it sounded like Italian. I was thinking, are you sure about this? Yeah, good point. But yes, Mel being
anybody who's a
traditionalist.
So anybody out there who's an expert in church Latin or Latin, come in and get to us of what was going on in Mel's head with his Latin. Now, his Aramaic, I can't speak. You know what? The one thing I did notice with the Aramaic is it definitely, nobody seemed to speak it naturally. Yeah. It all sounded kind of like they were really working hard to pronounce it.
And actually, just on that, the cast. Let's move to the cast. The movie was made in Italy in winter. Apparently, a lot of the time, the actors were freezing, particularly poor Jesus on the cross. It was a fairly difficult production. Now, the lead guy is, I hope I've got this pronunciation right, Jim Caviezel, who was 36 at the time of filming. He suffered injuries during the whipping scenes when the whips actually made contact with him, as opposed to being stopped by some invisible object on the set. And he got struck by lightning. The makeup took hours. And apparently one day when he was all made up, ready to go, then the weather wasn't right for the scene. And he decided to go to bed in the full makeup because he couldn't be bothered to have it reapplied the next day. So it seems to have been a very difficult shoot for him. Pretty much all the rest of the cast are Europeans of some sort. For example, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is played by Maya Morgenstern, who's an established Romanian actress, mainly in European films, and she is only 6 years older than Caviezel, so she had him really young. Mary Magdalene is played by Monica Bellucci, a long-established Italian model and actress, who is married to, I didn't know this till you pointed out, to Vincent Cassel, the well-known French actor. The other actors are either Bulgarians or Italians. So when you say everyone is pronouncing things, I mean, no one obviously knew Aramaic, and you've got all these people with their different native languages, probably trying to pronounce it as best they can, but they have their underlying accents underneath it.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe Hebrew would give you a leg up on pronouncing Aramaic.
Oh, I asked Gil and Omri about that. Apparently, not really. They say that you can pick out a few words. That's about it.
Yeah, so even if they had some people who were fluent in Hebrew, it really wouldn't have, it's really a matter of just doing your best to phonetically memorize these lines, which is a pretty amazing thing that this is something nobody knows.
Yes. I suppose even though everyone did look like they're sort of trying to get through it by pronouncing it, I don't know, they seem to have all done a fairly good job. And you wouldn't be able to tell, listening to them, that they come from all these different backgrounds.
I'm a big Jim Caviezel fan, so he might not have crossed over very much to Australia. He was in a couple of bigger movies. I'm trying to think, before The Passion, he was in a few movies, and then where he was the main star, and then he's a Catholic. I don't know if he's quite as traditionalist as Mel is, but he had a tough time getting work in Hollywood after this, and at least he ascribes it to being in this film. But he, not too long after that, he was in a really good show where he played kind of a good guy, bad guy, if you know what I mean, kind of a anti-hero type character who worked for a secret government organization. That it was a really good movie, and or television show, and I can't remember what it was called. Oh, Person of Interest. It was a really good concept that each episode, he would get knowledge of somebody who had almost been picked up for a pre-crime type situation, like Minority Report, and he would have to save this person. Like the computer algorithm would say that based on all this surveillance, it was really big when the NSA, it was right about the time that it had come out that the NSA was tapping everybody's phones and listening in on everything, that through their algorithms and through face recognition, they could come up with the percentage of a chance of somebody being murdered. And his whole thing was, each episode was to use like the fancy computers, because you have fancy computers, and he would try and save that person. And then it led to like this conspiracy of the person who was trying to actually use this system to kill off people that he wanted to kill. So as the series is progressing, they're figuring out that all these people aren't just random, that they're all tied together.
Well, that sounds like it.
It was actually quite good.
Is it fairly recent?
I think it was the 20-teens. It maybe ended around 2016-ish. Okay. I think it ran until, so not too long ago. And then he was also in the remake of The Prisoner, that I think that came out maybe in about 2008, which was controversial. And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
I saw the original Prisoner when I was a kid. It was considered landmark television because it was art house in a lot of ways. It was utterly cryptic, stylish and delightful. I don't think any of those things could be said for the remake. It's like, let's remake Michelangelo's David. What? Why? What's the point? The original is perfect.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that it was an interesting concept. If they had not called it The Prisoner, they could have called it something else, and it wouldn't have had to carry that baggage to live up to the original one.
That's a good point. If they just made it a different show.
So, Gary, it's probably a good thing we should mention is that one of the sources that we used to look at this, at the various scenes of this movie, was a Baptist author we basically didn't have to recreate the wheel with the movie. He had basically done it for us. But tell us a little bit about that author, just so that we can give him the credit that he's due. And then maybe we can talk a little bit more about the perspective that someone who's a Baptist or a Protestant might be coming to that's different than how Mel would approach this movie.
The man is James R. Wicker, who was writing on a website run by the Baptist Press, which presumably is a publishing company that produces books for Baptists. And he had an article on the website where he runs through the movie and he goes through the things which aren't in the Gospels. Now, to Protestants, that's important. If it's not in the Gospels, is the general Protestant attitude, it shouldn't be in the movie. Catholics and Orthodox have a quite different view to that. Now, he starts off by noting what he believes to be Mel Gibson's Mariolatry. Now, Mariolatry is a Protestant concept which basically holds that the Catholics and, to an extent, the Orthodox, would that be right?
I would say the Catholics in later times have taken a different spin on it, but I would say generally anything non-Protestant would hold Mary in a pretty similar view, which would be a positive view.
Right.
So they would go with Mariology as opposed to Mariolatry.
No, that's a good way to make the distinction. To Protestants in those other traditions, Mary is raised to an inappropriate position, an inappropriately high position. I mean, in some of those traditions, you actually have Mary as being a co-redemptrix or co-redemptor, redeemer with Jesus, which the Protestants would utterly reject. And a lot of Protestants would say, yes, Mary, mother of Jesus, cool, but let's just stop it there, right? And I don't think the Protestants have the notion of the Immaculate Conception. And the Immaculate Conception, contrary to what a lot of people believe, has got nothing to do with Jesus. That is the largely Catholic, maybe Orthodox notion, that Mary was conceived without sin. And sin, in some Christian traditions, has been passed down from Adam. And every human being has Adam's original sin. There are some traditions which simply reject that whole concept, but there you go. So Mr. Wicker, or Dr. Wicker, criticises Mel Gibson for his emphasis on Mary, which he perceives as a bad thing. And it's something that a Baptist, I suppose, would actually really pick out as saying, no, you're going too far here. And some of his comments seem a bit carping, but he makes a few points which seem to indicate that Mary is being given an unduly high place. But the comments are fairly, it's like he's looking for trouble. So, for example, he notes that the movie has the disciples Peter and John calling Mary mother, and in the subtitles, it's clearly capital. Now, you can say, well, I mean, so what? They're calling her mother. Okay, maybe you would call lots of people mother. And the capitalisation. So you could take that as an example of him really looking his way to nitpick things. And he notes some other instances, for example. Peter seems to regard Mary as a saintly figure, and Mary seems to be injected into the movie in some places that she actually wasn't. Now, the whole Mariolatry thing, I don't know. I mean, what do you think of it?
I think that it's definitely a bee in the bonnet to a lot of Protestants for whatever, if it's something that, going back to Luther, of a way to differentiate themselves from Catholics, is that Catholics are really into Mary. I don't know if Protestants necessarily knock her down a notch. I mean, in practical terms, they knock her down a notch. And you had said in the notes that Baptists, and I've heard this before as well, that Baptists say that Mary and Joseph physically had children after Jesus. So that's also denying the perpetual virginity of Mary, which is an absolute bedrock of Catholicism and really pre-Protestant religion, that Christianity is that Mary was a virgin through her whole life.
Yeah, the Protestants aren't much fussed about that, are they? They are perfectly willing to concede that when Jesus' siblings are mentioned, they could well have been his half-siblings through Joseph. Well, they wouldn't even be half-siblings, would they? They'd be full siblings. Well, theology. Okay. I
guess in the technical sense, they'd be half-siblings, but in maybe a legal sense, they'd be full siblings.
Yeah. I think when they went to register the birth at the Jerusalem town hall, they didn't put down God as the father. So legally, they would have been full siblings.
And in the gospel accounts, Jesus does trace his ancestry through Joseph as well.
Yeah, that's always been a tough one for some bits of Christianity to explain away. The consensus I've read is that, yes, of course God was the father, but, legally, he was adopted into the house of David. of whom Joseph was a scion. It's fine to put in the genealogy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole different tangent for probably a different episode to get into, because that's an interesting thing. And I don't think that I just thought of this right now, is that would Joseph have been dead? I don't know if they've ever said when Joseph died, but there's no mention of Joseph being anywhere near the Passion.
As far as I can recollect, Joseph disappears immediately after the story of when Jesus is a pre-teenie, and he goes to the temple and amazes everyone with his incredible knowledge.
Yeah, so after that, and I don't know if there's any after story about what happened.
No, I think that's the last time you hear of Joseph. He just disappears. Poof, never mentioned again.
Because then that's something to say, is that he doesn't even get, so Mel also poofs him out of the story. Like, you would never see him in the background, like consoling Mary or something like that. That would have been an interesting thing to think about.
Doesn't tradition hold that Joseph was very old at the time he married Mary?
Yeah, but I mean, very old in those days. He could have been 35.
He could be 35. That'd be very old. Yeah.
I think that that's one other thing that they did get with Mary, is that the actress was only a few years older than Jim Caviezel, but in the grand scheme of things, Mary could have been as little as 13, 14 years older than Jesus.
Yes, she could have well have been. I mean, and as you said, I think the average lifespan in Roman times was about 35. So basically just post-pubescent would probably be the standard marrying age.
Yeah, and so Jesus, he's about 33. Mary would have been, maybe on the outside 50. Tops. And maybe as low as in her early 40s. Yeah. Well, no, wait, I'm doing my math here wrong. Yeah, she could have been in her mid 40s, easily enough. And I think that, some of the art, like the most powerful art, like Michelangelo's Pietas, showing her so young and then holding Jesus, I think that that's almost what Mel was going for in the movie, is to kind of demonstrate that, she is not that much older than he is.
That's true. Yeah, that could well have been the case.
And I kind of appreciate that showing the apostles is not that old too. Like, you always a picture in your mind of Peter looking all old and gray and everything, white hair. He presumably would have been maybe 30s.
He would have been about the same age as Jesus. But in most movies, he is depicted as almost like Santa Claus, isn't he? Big, there's some, what's that famous, Quo Vadis, is it, I think? Where Peter's portrayed by this old actor and big bushy beard. Although at that point, Peter would have been, in his 60s.
Probably.
And looking a really old 60s, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, times were definitely, being 60, you would have lived a lot harder of a life than somebody 60 these days.
A lot rougher, and you would have, to get to that age, you would have probably survived some very serious diseases and lost all your teeth.
Then one of the movie really follows the Catholic idea of the Stations of the Cross.
I'm only vaguely familiar with them. Can you tell us what they're about?
And I think this is done the week leading up to Easter. So in Holy Week, they do different readings and recollections around the church of this is what happened at this point. And this is when Jesus fell carrying the cross. And this is when, this happened with the scourging. And I think that all throughout the movie, the question that I had is, and I don't know how much this necessarily fit into the gospel narratives, is that Pilate says that he doesn't want to kill Jesus, that he just wants to kind of teach him a lesson. But then the scourging, it beats him to a pulp, to fairly much death. And it just seems like the motivations for Pilate at every scene don't quite make sense to what the gospel accounts make. Pilate seems to have wanted to just get him dead and done with and moving on, so that he just can, barely keep a lid on this totally boiling over situation that, he's the governor of in Judea. So it's really, I find that this movie is kind of difficult to talk about because the way it's filmed skips around a lot. It fairly much follows the Passion, but then the Passion narrative, but then it interjects different scenes from the Gospels at almost random points in the movie. And so I found, just coming up with a way to talk about this movie that isn't just nitpicking each scene is definitely a challenge.
It does seem to have a lot of flashbacks, doesn't it? I mean, the movie does start in the traditional starting place of the Garden of Gethsemane, but throughout the movie you'll have a flashback to Jesus when he is a young carpenter, and in that little scene he's making what looks to me to be like a very sophisticated table for that time period. I mean, I'd buy that table. Looks quite good. And then it'll also have various flashbacks to the Last Supper, which, as you say, seem to be randomly just dropped in there. Whereas it might have been better to not start at Gethsemane, but start at the Last Supper. And the flashbacks are short, but they do come out of the blue, don't they?
Yeah, it seems to me, I agree that if they had started with the Last Supper scene, it would have start right there, and that would have made a whole lot more sense than the Garden of Gethsemane. That one is an impossible one. You get my drift. The garden is starting it there. It would have been a lot more logical to just, instead of inserting the Last Supper scene kind of towards the middle to the end, just move that forward. And I didn't see a good commentary of why he was inserting those flashbacks the way he did.
No, I found them, like you, a bit annoying. Why are we seeing this now? And one or two times I had to be reminded, oh yeah, it's a flashback. Okay, right. And as far as I remember, the flashbacks aren't subtitled, are they? So it doesn't say The Last Supper. It just has this scene.
No.
And you go, oh yeah, that must be so-and-so.
And they're very short, too. I kind of there was a couple of them I wanted to see played out a little bit more. There were some of the flashbacks were non-canonical, and I don't even think they were from the Apocrypha, like the scene where he was making the table. I think that was straight from Mel Gibson's head. And then the scene where Jesus falls as he's like maybe a toddler, and Mary like goes and runs, and it didn't even look like a bad fall. I wasn't really sure where, maybe that she was so concerned that she knew he was the Son of God, and then she's, not watching him properly, and he falls.
Well, you must admit, Mary had form in that area. Remember how when Jesus is pre-20, Mary and Joseph go back home, and they've forgotten Jesus. Mm-hmm. Now, talk about a Home Alone situation. And then they discover him in the temple. So Mary's got form with not looking after the Son of God.
Yeah, and so I think that people definitely had problems with those two scenes in particular. Right. Then the flashback to the Last Supper where they're sitting, and there's nothing to say that they would have been eating a Roman-style banquet where they were laying down.
Yeah. One thing to note about the whole timing of this, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, differ radically from the Gospel of John as to the timing of the entire Passion. In the Synoptic Gospels, all the action from the Last Supper to Jesus' death happens on Passover Day. And of course, in the Jewish system, Passover Day starts at sunset and goes to sunset. In the Gospel of John, it does not happen on Passover Day. It happens on the day before Passover. Most people tend to go with John's dating because the dating of the Synoptic Gospels is inherently unlikely. Because if you follow the Synoptic Gospels, you're saying that all of Jesus' trials and interrogations by the high priests happened on Passover. That's just not going to happen. Passover is a very holy day, and it is a sabbatical day of rest. They are no more going to convene a court on Passover than a Christian country would convene a court on Good Friday, specifically to put a man to death. So that's a little point. And it's one of the things which is glossed over. But the movie specifically does say it's on Passover because Mary, Jesus' mother, at one point says, how is this night different from any other? Which is the traditional introduction to Passover.
So under John's, all the action would have happened on a Friday.
Yes, which was not Passover.
And then the Passover would be the next day?
Yes, under John, Passover
on Saturday.
Passover coincides with the Saturday, which is a Sabbath also. So John removes the problem.
where we get in the movie is they kind of drag everything out with Jesus's interactions with Pilate on that day, and then his beatings all day, and then he has to walk all the way with the cross. Like, everything's dragged out. And then at the very end of the movie, when Jesus is crucified and there's that single drop of rain, and then the Romans like freak out, it's time, they have to do something, and they kill all of the two other prisoners, and then, or they don't directly kill them, they break their legs with the mallets, which in crucifixion, that's what you did to make the process go faster, because crucifixions could go on for 2 weeks. The person might die of exposure before they died from any direct cause of the crucifixion. And it would make sense under John's accounting, because they wanted the Jews need that to be done by 5, 6 o'clock.
That's right.
Night.
It all has to be over and done with before the Saturday Sabbath starts. So they're operating on a timetable. Whereas under the synoptics, there is no timetable, and they're breaking their own laws. So,
or there would be a time. Yeah, there would be. It just wouldn't happen, because that would be a no work day.
Yeah, exactly. No work.
That Friday would be a no work day. So there would be no, and it would be under John's though. It would be that they would not want to be messing around at all. They would want that stuff done, because that's like a super Sabbath.
Yes,
night.
It would be.
Being the Sabbath before Passover, which I believe it's totally escaping me, but there's a name for that, a Friday Sabbath before Passover. And it is it's a more intense Sabbath. And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Yeah. And another argument in John's favour is the Last Supper itself. Now, in John, the Last Supper is not a Passover meal, because it does not happen on Passover evening. It's just a normal meal. But most Christians, but traditionally in Christianity, Christians ignore John's thing and say that the Last Supper was a Passover meal. And a lot of scholars point out that is unlikely, because in Jewish tradition, the Passover meal is a family affair. You don't go to a gentleman's club and celebrate Passover with your male friends. You celebrate it with your family. It'd be the equivalent of Christmas. Like Christmas is in the Christian tradition is a family affair. It's not something where you go with your male friends to a restaurant to celebrate. It's just that'd be considered, just not done. So that's a minor thing.
And even in sects of Judaism today, where the men and women pretty much stay separate, Sabbath is the time that everybody's together. So I think that this is a good thing, and it'll get us into a couple of individual scenes. Let's talk about some of the maybe Mel Gibson's flourishes that he adds in.
Now, we've said that in general, Mel follows the gospel accounts pretty closely, even down to the dialogue. But he has some distinctive non-gospel flourishes. Many that he gets from someone I'd never heard of, called the Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich. And she seems to be a Catholic mystic, lived in the 1600s, 1700s, do you remember?
I have vaguely heard of her, but I think, she is one of the big ones that the Catholics will often, especially the traditional Catholics, will connect to somebody who that time period of like the 1600s around the Council of Trent is kind of an important time period for traditionalist Catholics.
Oh, I see. I didn't know that. Oh, okay. Anyway, so a typical Gibson flourish taken from this German mystic occurs right at the beginning in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he introduces Satan, who, interestingly enough, is played by a female actor. And I didn't pick up on that until I read the cast description, because they look, I suppose, pretty androgynous, don't they? They look pretty spooky, that's for certain, going around in a big hood and that. So Satan appears. That's not in the Gospels. There is no Satan. It's just not there. And Satan pops up a few times in the course of the movie. She appears at one point carrying sort of a demon child. Oh, that's another flourish that Mel puts in. A few times demons appear, particularly after Judas has betrayed Jesus, but he then goes back to the priests and he says, "No, I don't want your money." And then he is taunted by what at first start off to be children, will then turn into little demon children. children's little demons, okay, little Damians from The Exorcist. So he has a couple of those little flourishes which are taken elsewhere. And a strict Protestant would say, no, this is illegitimate. But I suppose for all of us, I mean, look, hardly anyone would actually notice they were different.
Yeah.
Although inserting Satan in there does seem to be, it's a little bit of dramatic license, I would have thought. But that's the only one I would have noticed. I mean, there's another incident where a crow pokes out the eyes of one of the thieves on the cross. I wouldn't have known that wasn't in there. I thought, yeah, okay. A bit dramatic maybe, but yeah. So he has these flourishes, but in general he follows the Gospels.
And my thinking was why he put Satan in, especially in those early scenes, is that he never gets to the temptation of where Jesus is out in the desert and wants to somehow show that Jesus has been tempted. And again, like if he had just done a narrative, he could have gotten in all those pieces. But the way, I think that was, to me, the major fault I keep coming back to the major fault of the movie is that starting off in the garden, you're missing all those other key elements of the story that happened before that point, and a lot of the things that happen after the garden don't make as much sense, and you have to fit them in some way. I'm imagining that all of the people who would watch the movie have at least the broad strokes of the way things are supposed to go, but you're kind of expecting some of these things, the temptation and the Last Supper and those sort of things, and they all seem kind of, he's shoehorning things in to get them in.
I mean, I suppose most people would know the temptation, but they would only have the vaguest idea of how it fits in. And in fact, the temptation is really the first big event of Jesus' life. So it occurred several years before Holy Week. But I doubt many people would register with that. So to them, it might be perfectly normal. Oh, yeah, of course, Satan appeared at Gethsemane.
Yeah, it's very odd. And how Satan is there, like that inversion of Satan with the holding the demon child, of the inversion of, Mary and Jesus. And then you have this evil version of Mary and Jesus. It was a little ham-fisted, I think.
Yeah. And for those of you who haven't seen the movie, the little demon kid, which Satan is holding, looks a lot like Gollum.
Yeah, it was weird. It was unexpected, for sure. I think one of the things that I found particularly interesting was all the extra bonus material that he gave to Pilate and Pilate's wife.
Oh, yeah.
Pilate's wife basically in the Gospels only gets the one line saying that you're condemning an innocent man or something to that effect, where in the movie it's chock filled with a lot of apocryphal things from the Gospel of Nicodemus and a couple other sources where she doesn't even have a name, I don't think, in the Gospels. They don't call her, where the later tradition is that her name was Procla. Yeah. In the movie, she's having these long dialogues with Pilate, and she winds up having a scene or two with Mary and Mary Magdalene, and none of that stuff is in the canonical Gospels. And I think even that meeting up with Mary, where they mop up the blood after the scourging, that's not in anything that I know of.
No, I've never heard of that. I think maybe he's added the scenes of Pilate's wife as a partial attempt to further exonerate Pilate. I mean, the Gospels are fairly clear that Jesus was killed by the Jews, and they try to exonerate Pilate as much as possible, and say that Pilate was basically trapped by his position or the circumstances, didn't really want to get rid of Jesus, and sort of was forced into it. Actually, interesting, there is a historical incident which happened about 50 years after Jesus died. A Jewish prophet arose, I think his name was also called Jesus, and he went around saying, the end of the world's coming, the end of the world. And exactly the same thing as happens with our Jesus is that the Jewish authorities take him to the governor at the time and said, this guy has trouble. The governor has him scourged and then interrogates him, and he says to this later Jesus, you're just a nutcase. Bye. And that's it. He's let off. So it seems that the governors, well, they were free to ignore the Jewish authorities, They weren't actually out to really kill people who, in their eyes, were really harmless.
And you get to that in the movie with Pilate. He doesn't necessarily want to kill Jesus because he knows Jesus has a camp of followers who might riot. But he doesn't want to get the Sanhedrin mad because they control a faction that might riot. And then in that scene where, and I think that Mel misses something in this scene, is that with when he offers up, it's either Jesus is going to get crucified or Barabbas, and Barabbas is just do you want to, and the Gospels portray it this way, do you want to pick this murderer who comes across as a stark raving mad like serial killer, or Jesus? And then the whole crowd erupts, we'll pick Barabbas, who, if you look at his name, Barabbas, son of the father, I mean, that sounds kind of similar to, and I believe that the scholarship says that Barabbas could have been another one of these truckfuls of Messiah claimants who was causing, because somebody wouldn't have been on just a run-of-the-mill murderer, I don't believe would have been under Roman arrest. The ethnarch would have taken care of that sort of thing. It would have been, if it was something running up against Roman power, is the type of person who would have been under Roman punishment.
And they would have had to do something very wrong. Yes, it wouldn't be for just an everyday murder. Crucifixion was reserved for the most heinous of rebels. The famous incident where the Roman general Pompey crucified thousands of the revolting slaves is, I think, the worst example. But I should also mention that the Jews, under the Maccabean kings, also crucified people they really, really didn't like. But it was considered not only a horrible punishment, but a demeaning one, saying that these people are so bad, they deserve the worst treatment possible.
Yeah, so I mean, we could say that maybe the Barabbas was just a cretin so terrible that the Romans felt they had to deal with him himself. But it would make a lot of sense of why would the audience, or the audience in that at the Caesarion where they were holding Jesus for trial, why are they going to pick this murderer? Now, you could say it's that because, they're just against Jesus and they want to see him go down, or it's that they're the supporters of this other Messiah person, that their Messiah is Barabbas and we want him to go free, and let's let this other guy who we think is a kook get crucified for let's get this Messiah person out of the way because we want our Messiah to be let off the hook. And then that's a whole nother group of people who were likely to riot. Yeah,
that could well be.
And I think that all throughout it, really, Pilate's really the only Roman who looks good, because otherwise they make the Romans look more barbaric than anybody else, the Sanhedrin or you name it.
The Roman torturers are depicted as absolutely horrible people. And this is the big thing about the movie. The Roman flaying of Jesus and his crucifixion is depicted at extended length with extended gore and violence. I mean, some critics hated the film and called it torture porn. So this is a film where I can imagine if you were seeing this in a theatre, some people may have left, certainly averted their eyes for a while.
Maybe a good place that we can zoom in towards is the end scene, because then that sort of wraps everything up. And one of the scenes of Jesus carrying the cross, I mean, how could somebody carry the cross after getting beat that severely and carry that cross? That I would have to assume that cross, 2 big logs like that, would be a couple of 100 pounds.
It's got to be more than that, surely. I mean, that thing was massive, wasn't it? I mean, I couldn't lift up one end of the cross piece, let alone the entire cross piece. That timber must have been, I'd say more than the weight of a man, an average man.
Oh, easily, yeah.
And I couldn't pick up a human. I couldn't drag a man, for that matter, really.
So then they pull Simon of Cyrene out of the crowd who's watching, and so a lot of the crowd's just jeering. That's entertainment in the first century AD, people want to watch somebody get crucified. Netflix wasn't as good back then, apparently. But did they set him up very much in the Gospels, or did they just name him?
Oh, it just appears and disappears. He's like Joseph of Arimathea in that respect. Joseph appears out of nowhere and then disappears.
And it's interesting that they would say somebody from Cyrene, which is pretty far away. Cyrene was the western side. I'm not sure. I believe it's the eastern side of Libya. But it's pretty far away. So this was a guy who was a Jew who came back to Jerusalem for the Passover. Just happens to be walking down the street. Hey, you're coming and helping to bring this cross all the way out into the middle of nowhere. And, that's an interesting story in and of itself.
Now, Cyrene did have a substantial population of Jews at the time, as did Egypt. And in fact, I think that's where that part of the diaspora of Jews stops. So just before Tripoli, from Tripoli to the Atlantic, there weren't that many Jews. But the eastern side of the North African coast had fairly high Jewish populations. But yeah, Simon would have been probably maybe he did it every 10 years or something, because it would be a major job to get there. It'd take weeks unless he caught a boat, and a boat would be really expensive. And of course, if you got a job, which everyone did, it would have been time off work for a while.
I mean, say he even did take a boat, I would have to, I want to say that even to get from Alexandria to Judea was a good 3-4 days, and that's about as close as you can get.
Yeah.
And so say it's probably 2 weeks one way, even by a boat. So that's 4 weeks off of work, and then you're going to stay there probably a couple of months to make it worth your while. So that's not something you're doing every year.
No, it couldn't be, could it?
Unless maybe he was a trader.
Well, I suspect in those days for Jews, it may have been like the Muslim Hajj, which you're only meant to do once in your lifetime, aren't you? Yeah.
Yeah. And that's probably I've thought a lot about this. That's probably a real reason why the diaspora of Judaism grew away from Judaism that was going on in the Holy Land. It's because when you don't have a ton of contact, or your only contacts through letters, and maybe, once in a while somebody comes from the old country, your beliefs and your systems are going to diverge from what's going on in the old country.
Yes, very much. In some ways, I've become more conservative. I was talking to the two people who run the podcast of Biblical Proportions, which is going through the Old Testament literature. And they said that and they live in Israel, and they said that when modern diaspora Jews visit Israel, a lot of them are absolutely dumbfounded, because on the Sabbath, shops are open, things are happening. So they're quite surprised to find out it's not quite what they expected. And they've preserved a more conservative version of Judaism than is in modern Israel. So I would have thought the same thing would happen back then.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if that was the case, if they were holding on to a more conservative form, or did they loosen up a little bit because they were, I had read it, they can't, anything that they say of statistics is fairly much just made up. But a place like Alexandria, I think it was a significant portion of the population of Alexandria was Jewish.
That's certainly what I've read. Well, I've read up to like a third of the city. I don't know, but everyone agrees that there was a very significant portion. I know Alexandria was divided into five quadrants. And yes, that word quadrant apparently is used correctly. Quadrant does not necessarily mean a division into 4. I actually looked this up. Quadrant can be used to mean any sort of divisions. So Alexandria was divided into 5 quadrants, and one whole quadrant was given to the Jews. So they must have been at least around about 20%.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that if somebody like Simon of Cyrene, if he was coming in and if he was more liberal, if you will, and more Greekified, or than the people who were in Jerusalem, or if he's coming in and he's actually, but then what's conservative at that point too, because there's so many different Judaisms. I mean, even within the Sanhedrin, you have people who have such diametrically opposed views, people who believe in angels, people who believe in an afterlife, and people who don't believe in an afterlife. I mean, you could almost say that inside of the religious authorities over this religion, that they're different religions.
Oh, yes. I mean, certainly the division between the Sadducees and the Pharisees was still going strong at this point, and they disagreed with each other quite a bit. So there was certainly those sort of divisions. And, of course, you had all the wacky little groups hanging around.
The Zealots, and you have somebody like Philo of Alexandria who's writing things that sound kind of Christian, and that's probably why he why his writings got passed on, is because he's writing things that they have kind of a Christian twang to them, if you will. And the early Christians definitely liked Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jew who lived, I think he would have died right around the time Jesus was born.
Just at that time.
So we finally get to Golgotha, which they depict Golgotha as pretty much a mountain, I would say.
Well, I know Golgotha was meant to be the place where Adam's skull was buried. The Gospels don't call it a hill. They just say it's a place. But traditionally it's come to be termed a hill.
And presumably the Romans would have picked that so that they could show off.
Yes, and it's a demonstration. I mean, you wouldn't crucify people in a private garden or a valley somewhere. You want them to be somewhere where everyone can see. The exact equivalent of putting a head on a pike on the town gate.
What were some of the scenes that really stuck out with you of the actual crucifixion? With so he's crucified with the two thieves, and the one is against Jesus and the one is for him. And they portray that pretty well.
They do. The thing which horrified me about the crucifixion scene was actually when Jesus is on the cross and the cross falls down. And so he's on the cross and it just goes bang. And you've seen this guy being tortured for ages. And now he's... So that's what really struck me. And I don't think that's in the gospel accounts, is it? It can't be.
No, I don't think so. You get... Mel Gibson has to show something that was written in text visually. So he has a lot of license to throw things in on the side, like a lot of the scenes with Mary that we don't necessarily know if Mary was there or not, or what she was doing or what other people were doing. So that gives a filmmaker all the license in the world to do whatever they want with that stuff that's not been shown or not been explicitly stated.
But by the time we get to Jesus' crucifixion, I mean, we are all horrified at what he's already gone through. And compared to what he's gone through, the crucifixion almost looks like a mercy. Because at least the thieves who have been crucified, they seem in fairly good nick. Yes, they're about to die, but they haven't been tortured as Jesus was.
And Jesus dies on the cross, and in the gospel account, the screen in the Holy of Holies that separates the Holy of Holies from everything else is rent or ripped open. But in the movie, how do they show it?
Well, they do explicitly show the temple in the curtain being ripped from top to bottom, which is exactly what the Gospels say. Interestingly, one thing Mel Gibson does not show is a passage from the Gospel of Matthew, which says that the dead arose and walked. And I suppose a few people would actually know that's there, because that's a pretty big event, isn't it? You'd think someone in Jerusalem would have noticed this?
Yeah, wasn't Elijah walking through there was a couple of the big names were just walking through town.
So, but it's interesting, he omits that and basically substitutes it with an almost apocalypse.
Yeah, it was a really interesting ending. And then really the end of the movie is Jesus leaving the tomb.
The very final scene, you see Jesus is under the shroud in the tomb. The stone rolls away. Gradually, the shroud collapses onto the slab, and then the camera pulls back, and he walks out.
I think so much of the movie was really stunning and visual. If they had just toned down the graphic nature of it, I think it would have meant so much. It would have been such a better movie and would have gotten to the same point that he was going for. If they had turned it down from a 10 to a 7, it would have made it tremendously better.
The phrase gratuitous violence comes to mind, doesn't it? Yeah, I agree. It's like it's on a 10, but it could have been a 7, made its point just as effectively, and you would have probably had fewer people walking out of the theatre.
Well, I think this is definitely, I would love to hear what the people out there listening have to say about the film.
Yeah, same here. So send in your comments, folks.
I want to thank everybody out there for listening. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I think you should definitely go out there and watch the movie, read your Gospels, because I think it's a good comparison tool to, it's a good exercise to kind of see why somebody would make certain decisions based on the text. And, definitely write in with your comments, and we'll be waiting with bated breath for 2022 when the Passion of the Christ Resurrection hits the theaters.
Yeah, that's going to be a short movie because all the resurrection scenes, there isn't that many of them. If you go through the Gospels, I mean, I'm sure some people think, you've got chapters and chapters about Jesus' resurrection, but there's just a couple of incidents, and that's it. And the actual resurrection happens off stage.
Yeah, I can't imagine how you would make a whole movie out of that. But how long was it between the resurrection and then the ascension? Do they give a time frame for that?
No, they don't. I mean, he comes back on the Sunday, where in one account, Mary Magdalene sees this angel, Jesus or something, in outside the tomb, and that's that. And then there's the story of doubting Thomas, and there's one other meeting story, no particular time frame. I think it's usually considered to be 1 or 2 weeks, and that's about it. That's it. Yeah,
so I wonder if they're going to spend maybe more time in Acts, like going up to the Pentecost maybe, and what the other people were doing during that year. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what where he takes that.
Actually, that'd be a good point to end it at the Pentecost.
Garry and I would like to thank you again for listening. We'll definitely love to hear your feedback on this movie, because I'm sure everybody has an opinion on this, and multiple opinions. And, we'd love to talk about them. So signing off for today. It was, as usual, wonderful speaking to you, Garry, and I hope people enjoy.
Toodles!